Jeff McMullen is a journalist, author, and filmmaker with an explorer's fascination for the world and its many different people. Jeff's most passionate work, though, has been in his lifelong commitment to improving the health, education, and human rights of Australia's Indigenous people. It all started here at Macquarie University, where he was in the very first ever intake of students. Hello, Jeff McMullen. What made you choose Macquarie?
It was a brand new, fresh approach. I was in the first intake of undergraduates in 1967, and Macquarie offered me a way to continue working as a young ABC journalist and yet to grow my understanding of the world. And I was able to come and go from part-time studies while working in the practical development of journalism. And I think the two meshed together. Macquarie had not begun its media studies, so I was building units of cultural studies, history, how the world works, which I think is the essential platform for good journalism.
Was that unusual for the time?
In the 1960s, most journalists in the newspapers and wire services would not have thought tertiary education was a necessity, but my generation broadly changed that. We realised that not only the technology was changing, but our engagement with the world meant we were shrugging off our inheritance of the British BBC style of broadcasting and the newspaper inheritance through the old wire service structures, and we needed to find our own voice. And I think we began in the 1960s to see tertiary education as an essential. If you were going to build your understanding in any profession, you needed constant learning, lifelong learning.
So can you just paint me a picture of what a week was for you, balancing work and university at that time?
The 1960s was the struggle in the street by Aboriginal people for their rights, and so as a young reporter, I was out in the real world, and then I had this reflection. I would go at night, walk across the cow paddocks as they were surrounding a few buildings at Macquarie, and sit with people who were looking at the world in a theoretical way. But the cultural studies I did in those early years gave me an understanding of the conflict, that there was a global pattern to this. Interestingly, I went from that Aboriginal struggle in the street to the First Nations of the world, to Guatemala, to the genocide there, to the Amazon and the genocide there, to that pattern of dispossession, theft of the land and conflict.
One of your mentors at the time was author Thea Astley. What sort of an influence did she have on you?
I was one of 4 students who were privileged to take a very early class with Thea Astley, the novelist, and we had to submit written work to be considered. As a journalist, I didn't offer her journalism, I offered her wild fiction, and she encouraged all 4 of us to find our own voice. She had an extraordinary ear for listening to everyone, any stranger that she met. And she would say, "Do you mind if I use that?" And as our understanding deepened, she encouraged me to use everything I saw around me, good, bad, ugly, tragedy, things occurring in my life. And if you develop that art of listening, interestingly, throughout life, I noticed the most intelligent people, in my view, were not the babbling brooks. They were the deep listeners who were more interested in gathering what they could from you. The brilliance of listening is that it expands what you know before you get to the contest of ideas. And I carried Thea's motivation with me forever, really. Find your own voice, write what you believe, discover the authentic. Those were her great lifelong lessons.
You were the youngest ever ABC foreign correspondent. Can you tell me about that, please?
We were all young in the 1960s and we all wanted to go out to the world. Roaming at such a young age was another kind of education. At 18, I was in Papua New Guinea. At 19, I was in New Delhi and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. I would come back to my studies at university with a whole different contribution, with a whole lot of questions, with a whole deeper understanding of where Australia fitted into our part of the world. So the life of a foreign correspondent is also constant learning. I went behind all kinds of walls, borders, iron curtains, impenetrable communist enclaves that had not been visited by journalists. And of course, I went deeper and deeper into my exploration of that pattern of First Nations dispossession.
Most Australians would recognise you as Jeff McMullen, the 60 Minutes reporter. What was it like working on a program that was so huge at the time?
It was a different era. If you imagine there was no internet, satellite television was just developing. Late 1970s, programs like 60 Minutes were a magazine that allowed Australian voices to tell the stories about anything in the world. This program on Sunday evenings was watched by most Australians, and we had the role of being able to cover any issue, any subject on earth and go anywhere and develop stories with more length than that daily news gathering. Even though I had been doing it for 2 decades, what I hugely enjoyed at 60 Minutes was the ability to be able to go to places that in the ABC years we simply did not have the time or the budget to be able to reach. It was a huge growth in opportunity to tell stories.
You've spent a lot of your life campaigning for Indigenous rights. What drives that commitment?
The very first story that I told on 60 Minutes was an Aboriginal issue. The very first short film that I scripted, a newsreel on the ABC television, was an Aboriginal subject. I chose to work on that patch because I had already understood that this was our challenge. To be here, you must try to understand not only what has happened, but what is occurring before our eyes. What we neatly wrap up as the unfinished business is a great challenge to understand, why is that so? Why have these issues persisted across generations? And for all of the stories that have been told, why has there been such slow change? My awakening came through my family upbringing. My mother told my brothers and I a story that when she was a very young child, she asked her father, why can't the Aboriginal kids that she played with in the paddock go to school? And her father explained that Aboriginal children were not allowed to go to that school. And I heard myself 60 years later explaining to my children in a remote community why Aboriginal children were not entitled, were not given the right, were not even seen to need that same kind of education that my children were enjoying in suburban Sydney. And I heard through the voice of my children the same thing my mother had asked. Why is this? And so to me, I can't see how you can be here without being drawn to this, because in the foundations of the Aboriginal story is also the principle of custodianship. It is the mix of various cultures and worldviews within the peoples of Australia that offers us the most hopeful prospect of building a truly wonderful new society. There is an ancient diversity here that is the foundations for our modern multiculturalism. And that, of course, is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always said to us. They open their arms and say, come and be part of it. The land holds us all. That was the lesson to me. I cannot see how you can be here without feeling it, without being drawn to it, without becoming part of it.
Tell me about your family and how you all became involved in this struggle.
When my children were very small, some of them still in the backpack, they came with my wife Kim and I as we went with Aboriginal people on various projects. So travelling with those children at a young age gave them an invaluable, inspiring example of people who can change and improve things by working together. My son Will took up the principle of custodianship. He works on sustainability. He went to Macquarie University and with his major in international law and global governance, looks at that broad human responsibility to nurture the planet. I would say he picked that up as a kid, watching Aboriginal people on country look after country. My daughter Claire studied at Macquarie University, a double degree, became a lawyer, went off, covered the Khmer Rouge genocide tribunal, reporting on that tragedy day after day. She went on to Washington, D.C. and did a Master's of International Law at Georgetown Law School, and only recently has worked with the great Washington Post team of Bob Woodward and Robert Costa on their book, Peril. I would say what those children gleaned, wandering, observing, listening with Aboriginal people, motivated their understanding of human rights and also of the enormous possibility, if you believe that you can contribute, that you could raise your voice, as Thea Astley used to say, and that you have a responsibility to work with people who can improve society.
When you look back over your life's work in this arena, does it make you feel hopeful?
As a writer and a filmmaker, I draw the most hope from the fact that Aboriginal storytellers have captured the attention of Australia in a way that no journalist ever did. I believe the hopeful change that is occurring is that ever so slowly the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and South Sea Islanders and the diversity of our population have slowly made Australians appreciate that we have something extraordinary happening in our generation's lifetime. We can actually see the possibility of taking people from everywhere, building on the ancient diversity, cultural understanding and responsibility systems that Aboriginal life traditionally had, and then seeing that by listening to one another, we come up with a method of working together. It's beyond politics. I see the importance of the voice of the First Peoples, which is the opening of the door to listening to the voices of all peoples that are now part of our population. It is about patience and persistence. We are still on that road at a crossroads in one sense. Are we going to be custodians and take up that sentient responsibility? Will we understand the complexity and the pace of change that's occurring in our world? Or do we turn back to being the predator, the natural born killer that simply out of self-interest looks after us? If we want our species to survive, I believe we have to take up that hopeful sense of being custodians.
And I think that's the perfect ending to this lovely conversation. Thank you so much, Jeff McMullen.
It's good to talk with you, Sandra. Thank you.